Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 469th New Social Environment. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Rob Swainston, Zorawar Sidhu, and Andrew Woolbright. We're thrilled to welcome poet Imogen Christian-Smith here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Artist Zorawar Sidhu was born in 1985 in Ludhiana, India, and currently lives and works in New York City. With a background in art history and fine arts, his projects recreate art historical artifacts using contemporary technology and historical materials and techniques. He has exhibited projects with galleries and museums nationally, including exhibitions with Marginal Utility, Spring Break Art Show with Field Projects, 5 Miles, and many more. Artist Rob Swainston was born in 1970 in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and currently lives and works in New York City. His work is informed by a dual academic background in political science and art. He is an associate professor at Purchase College and co-founder and master printer for Prince of Darkness. Rob has been awarded numerous residencies, including Skowhegan, Marie Walsh Sharpe, and the Fine Arts Work Center. And artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright is based in Brooklyn, New York, and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is a founder and director of the Gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side. In addition to curating, he writes for MoMA's, eFlux Art and Education, Two Coats of Paint, and White Hot Magazine. He currently teaches at SUNY New Paltz and will be an upcoming resident at the Sharpe Test Studio program in Dumbo for 2021-2022. So without further ado, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. So great seeing all of you this Monday morning, and so excited to get to talking about this incredible show that started off the year in a really impactful way. Doom Scrolling by Rob and Zorawar at Petzl Galleries, 35 East 67th Street location. You all have to make it over. Opened strategically and wonderfully on January 6th, and acts as a really visual, impactful form of like cultural memory, which we'll get to talking to. And Fong will say it better than I can, but part of the reason the New Social Environment series was begun in the first place, as Fong puts it, is to match the speed of Trump's lack of memory of like the tweeting and the incessant circulation of those things. And this show wonderfully delays all that so we can have time to think about it. So let's get to the slides. Hi, Zorawar and Rob.
Hi.
So here's an installation image, gorgeous gallery space, and a few of the works put together by the two of you. You collaborate on the show. Each work is the same size and titled with a date, the date that the images were put together. And I wanted to start off, collaboration is such an important part of, I think, what makes this work so rich and dimensional, and kind of the oversight both of you could give each other. But what was the beginning of the collaboration like for both of you? Like, what did you see in the other person that felt common enough to work with? And what were the things that you were excited about working through difference?
The first part about collaboration is that you ask your partner what they want to do. You want to talk first, or should I? Go ahead. All right, I'll do it. So, like, I can answer that in a couple different ways. The first is we're both artists, and we both have done printmaking, and we're both interested in like the image and how we read the image. Our collaboration started some years ago with just sharing. Like, I have a little more material knowledge in terms of print, ink, and processes, and how materially to make prints. Zorawar has a little bit more knowledge in Illustrator and the digital platforms, but we both overlap. And it was just, we started a project some years ago that was like, we're gonna just work on this together. Zorawar's gonna teach me a little more about Illustrator. I'll teach him a little bit more about ink viscosity. evolved into this project.
Yep. We had been we've been collaborating for 3 or 4 years now, and this project in particular has a lot of our common interests, but it also applies our backgrounds outside of art making. Rob has a previous background in political science. I have a background in art history, and so we were both able to apply those in addition to our common interests.
Very cool.
Very
Very exciting.
I was just going to add, like, from the political science point of view, like, these images are all a conversation, they're all negotiation, which is the starting point of what I think politics should be doing. So they're a demonstration of that in a really interesting way.
Absolutely. Here's another installation shot from the other side of the room, facing the wall we just saw. And going back to that negotiation, I mean, it is negotiated, but the whole body of work was done over basically the last year. It's like remembering a year, kind of during the pandemic and during the protests and also the political sphere happening at the same time. What would you say, like, it has so much urgency to it, but was there like an image or something that began this particular series beyond your typical collaboration? Like what was like kind of the moment for the both of you that this body of work had to kind of come out of?
I think we were already looking at the protests in Hong Kong at the very beginning of this, which was pre-COVID. We thought it was so strange to see protesters wearing masks, just regular surgical masks, clashing with police, umbrellas, tear gas in the streets. We'd already felt that kind of urgency watching those images.
And then we were sharing, like, just technical ways in which to sort of new ways to break an image up in print, because when you do color, you really got to separate it out into all these different layers and then you draw it. So we were exploring ways with these images to sort of recombine them and to print them. And in the process of doing it, like, yeah, like Zorawar said, like, COVID and the quarantine hits here, and then all of a sudden we have all of the protests, all the Black Lives Matter, all of the cultural war stuff that was here. And we were collectively doom scrolling. Like, at this point, Zorawar had lost his place in the city and was upstate, and we were doing Zoom like everyone else was doing. But we were sharing things on Zoom, how to do this. And we were doing our own doom scrolling, and like these fantastic images that don't even seem possible were coming across it. And we were just like, look at this, look at this. And we started to sort of put them together and put them together. But the one that we did kind of first and last that had the most urgency was, and we did it right after January 6th. We had been collecting all these images and working on drawings, and we really hadn't got anything yet until January 6th, 2021 happened. And that image that is in the show, some of the last layers were done at the end, but that one came fast and it was very urgent. And we really saw how to layer images on top of each other, make images in conflict, make things not just feel like one static news image, but to have the feeling that you're scrolling through and you're really doom scrolling. So that image, like, once we did that, we started to sort of say, oh, every one of these is a date. We need to sort of like look back at the last year and try to remember these very specific events. And then they started to come out, like, over the course of this year.
It's perfect. Anya, can we move to the next slide to get one of these examples of like a specific doom scroll? And the way, for those of you who have not seen the show yet, the way that this like delay is happening, the way that the images really kind of unfold in this slow way really does allow you to kind of pull them out of the doom scroll into this like way where you can like really consider them for longer amounts of time. One of the things I was really interested in seeing the show was in something both of you talk about and are really excited about is this relationship between the digital screen and then getting into this like, yeah, like fabricated labor, but then also returning the hand at moments into like like wood carving into this. Can you talk about what that process was like and how it felt in relationship to the pulling down of these images?
Well, the digital source images that we consumed on our phones are so fast, kind of absorb them quickly, and we kind of cycle through them very quickly. And woodcut's really the opposite of that, when it has to be made out of a carved piece of wood. The fact that these blocks came from wood that was outside in the streets during the protest kind of conceptually justified woodcut as the medium for this project, but also that pace of making, we hope, translates into the pace of viewing as a way to slow down and reconsider these images.
Sorry, Rob.
I
There's
mean,
a little bit of a delay.
That's right. I mean, for me, like, this is like maybe a little geeky as someone who's an artist, but also a printmaker. The division between media, like old media, new media, I think is largely arbitrary. So one of the core aspects of our collaboration has been to try to sort of like look at old media like woodcuts and other things that we've done and sort of apply the sort of the way we look at them digitally and all the different toolkits that we now have digitally to do it. And it is very laborious to do it, but anyone who's an artist knows this, that it's fun to make this stuff. It's unalienated labor. It's like one of the few chances we get to sort of have in our society where the thing that we're making doesn't alienate us, but that's maybe a little esoteric.
No, completely. I mean, I think the work has such dimensionality to it. I think it's this multiple layers of mediation that you're allowing yourselves to explore together. It really feels conversational, like knowing that these things are broken down into color channels and shape, and the unraveling of these things I really enjoyed. Like it might be obvious to everyone else, but when I first saw this image, like that bag shape in the top right was a delayed response for me. Like I was starting to think of it in terms of pandemic and starting to think about, you know, kind of like hazmat suits. And then once it came to me that's that incredibly distinct, legible mask that was under the chairs of the Congress people and senators, like it was this charge that kind of came after a long time of viewing, that I really started to kind of have this delayed entry point into the image of like remembering the trauma of that scene. How long do these things, how long did each one of these things take to put together and make?
Anywhere between a couple of weeks to maybe 6 months. Our Kyle Rittenhouse image, we began shortly after the shooting in Kenosha, and we didn't finish it until the trial. There's kind of a parallel to how we all kind of collectively remember that event.
And they take time to put together because the process through which we're both working on a montage and a collage together. And then in order to do color separations, you have to break an image into 12 different layers. And then you have to redraw all those layers. And then you have to put them back together, put them back on the press, choose your colors, and then print them. And then the wood interferes with it because the wood was so distressed. This printed, this didn't print it, put them on the wall. So they take time to sort of, all these steps along the way. You have to do this, you have to do this, you do all this planning, and then also you see it all at once. And then you make all these plans to work on it. Let's fix this, let's do this, let's add this. And then you get another chance to see it again. So there's these like regular punctuations of which like you sort of see what you have, and then you have all this time in which to strategize how you want to sort of improve it, how you want to change it, how you want to fix it. Some came out faster because the urgency was in the image and we had some workflows worked out. And some were just, we struggled with, again, we printed a very first state, second state, third state, very distinct. Throw that one away, do this one. But in terms of working on this project, we spent, Zorawar and I, and then when we started to edition it, we spent 40 hours a week for both of us, 60 hours a week for the last year working on this project. So it's very rewarding to see him go up right now, see him all together.
And it's so interesting. I mean, the only thing, I know it gets cited a lot, but like David's tennis court oath of the act of like making something that takes enough time that history is kind of intervening as the project goes. Like the images are changing while you're in the process of kind of conjuring them or like putting them together. And I want to talk about Montage, which is such an important part of this work, but and let the two of you kind of talk through how you think about it. But there's such wonderful moments in what I have to imagine only comes about because of how much time you're spending with these things. Like in this image where like what it looks like kind of like the flag in the top left corner starts to have parallel to the barriers on the bottom, like those bars run next to each other and kind of echo each other. It's really wonderful, like how these things are so dense, but also like finding moments of like parallel and mirroring. Can we move on to the next slide? In this one, you're really kind of allowing the grain to kind of, or the gesture of that grain. And is that machine invented? It's like that patterning?
That's cloud of smoke.
Wow.
Is that cloud of smoke is a quotation of Claude Mayon's a cloud that's a 17th century engraving. Throughout the project, we also are looking at the history of print and what it's capable of.
And the different ways in which like different things have been represented through history. This is like an engraving way in which like smoke and clouds were described historically. It doesn't exist. That's not the way we see them now, photographed, but we were very conscious about dropping these very specific art historical references. And some of it is like Zorawar and I, like, you know, having fun, like looking at how to build an image, like, oh, how was this done in the 16th century? How was this done in the 19th century? How would a painter do this? How would an engraver do this? And some of it is also us just like trying to sort of place these images in a very specific urgent moment, but also this timeless thing that is in art in which like there's a struggle, and the specifics of this Goya print from 1810 and the invasion of France and Spain, that particular event might be lost, but the urgency of that image still moves forward in time, and we still feel that when we look at those images today.
Astounding. I love it. And I love thinking of the two of you and your discussions and debates back and forth, because I think that kind of historic visuality is really what, like you said, gives this stuff urgency, or these images urgency, that we dream of pictures in a certain way. And part of that is due to the way Goya or Dürer, or like people in the past told us how to dream of these things. And like, I love the kind of tactical or strategic usage of those languages updated for the everyday. Can we move on to the next slide? It's another, like getting into like visors and shields and that reappearance of smoke. Next slide. And going back to visuality, I think there's another layer, obviously, kind of at work within this, that you're thinking of the way media has a role within all of this, where you're thinking not just of your own role, your own complicity, and like circulating these images through art galleries, but you're also, there are multiple moments where we see Sean Hannity or Fox News, or the way these images are kind of getting proliferated in the first place, and specifically in a polemic, divisive way towards one audience or another. But how are you finding that negotiation yourselves? Dealing with images that when we see them, typically we have our own kind of built-in priors or our relationship to them. They divide us kind of along political lines. How are you thinking about those and slowing that reception, or making it more dimensional, so it isn't, you know, like this Sean Hannity Fox News presentation?
I think what makes propaganda is the kind of clarity, how quickly understandable it is, the message of it, which is something that we've consciously been trying to avoid.
I mean, we want to be careful not to sort of like look like right-wing nut jobs or not by doing an image of, you know, the Proud Boys and Sean Hannity rally. I don't think this could be misconstrued as a pro-alt-right. It's very dystopic. But for me, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and Zorawar and I have had this discussion ongoing as we make these. For me, one of the, I think, key reasons that I've moved, I was always an artist, but I was also doing political science and sociology and history and institutional sociology. But one of the key reasons I moved out of the kind of academic knowledge like that and into the arts is because I saw a possibility visually that artists can interfere or continue to sort of be in dialogue with what we know in our present society through images. And I'll quote a little specific, Andrew and I shared this essay with you, this Agamben essay on difference in repetition, Guy Debord's cinema. He says something very interesting there, and it's about montage. And it's been written in other places by like D.B. Huberman and other places about how montage functions. When you first see an image, when we were doom scrolling these images in 2020 and 2021, they get stuck in our mind and they stay in that place in their past and they get set in their meaning. But if you can sort of reinsert these images in a different way back into our viewing and back into our consideration of this history, you can sort of unlock some possibilities that happened at that moment that have been since shut down because they get stuck in that moment. So some of us is like, hopefully by putting these images on this day, December 12th, what were you doing? What were you thinking? Do you remember this? Do you don't remember that? By opening up this image again and putting it in this overlapping thing, you make the possibility for another set of meaning, to sort of another alternative history and a new future to come out of it. It sounds a little esoteric and maybe a little art critical in art theory, but I actually, maybe dumbly believe that.
Me
Or
too.
actually, yeah, okay, good. We're on the same page.
Yeah. Zorawar, you spoke specifically too about like Eisenstein's like montage, specifically montage in the role of conflict. Would you like to, I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
As Eisenstein writes, montage formally is a conflict of scale, conflict of time, a conflict of space. We are trying to employ those strategies because every one of these images in the show is a depiction of conflict.
We had a very early moment in this, before any of these images, and they're not here, some of our early ones, in which we were trying to depict these events, and they were singular images, and they just weren't working. And then we did what sometimes you do in printmaking, is like, I'm just cleaning up the blocks, I'm gonna print them over top of each other. And we started to see conflicting images sit on top of each other, literally, on the page, and we were like, this is the way to do it. This is the way to do it. Image, for me, like, I mean, the distinction between collage and montage and decollage is like very useful to think about. A collage is like an illusionary space in which like you build something that everything makes sense. It's like a window, you're looking out of it. A decollage is a destruction of that. That's also a very useful tool. But a montage is really like sort of images conflicting with images that sit on top of each other and don't necessarily work. And that is kind of the way that I think we see images now. In terms of the immediate read that we scroll through them on our phone or look on the computer, we understand them really fast. But then when we continue to look at them, they start to fall apart and they don't make sense and they sit on top of each other mentally.
Yeah, and that lack of clarity in the image really parallels the lack of closure that we felt for a lot of these events, where the hope to see a justice that hasn't solidified yet.
With this image, the December 12th was a Trump rally in DC that the Proud Boys showed up. And like, I don't know, a number of people were stabbed and it was really violent, and it just kind of was a blip in the news stream, and now it's gone. By bringing it here and making it a very complicated image and keeping it in the stream, we can maybe hold these people accountable with this, or at least like, you know, keep this awareness and not just be like surprised next January 6th when this happens again, or surprised in the next election cycle and not be ready for it.
Well, I loved too in that Agamben response to Deleuze. There's a quote that he used by Paul Valery of what poetry was, where he defined poetry as the hesitation between sound and meaning. And I think that all these images are rightfully that hesitation or that delay, which, as they're talking about, is incredibly important to like actually getting to immerse yourself in these things and not just feel them as kind of, you know, like limbic shock or like fear or dread, but actually like sit with these things to actually, like you said, like go back to a date, December 12th, that went through a news cycle so quick that we're missing that people were stabbed, that it was an incredibly violent rally that has historical precursors to it, like ones that we should be vigilant against. Can we move on to the next slide? And this is the first one. I'm really interested in your color choices across the board, especially the protest ones and the protests that involve violence on the side of the police or the right. They get very hot. Like there's a lot of like red heat and oranges and yellows to them. And this is one of the first ones that struck me as this kind of like more comprehensible possible color palette in a way.
Our original color palette was just a simple red, white, and blue that you might see in an Uncle Sam poster or posters of around World War I. This image being one that deals with patriotism and the legacy of monuments, still has a little bit of that in it. This is a rare one where we're using flat, saturated blue that you would see in an Uncle Sam poster.
And then also like the red, white, and blue, like who owns the, I mean, in the culture wars in the 60s and the early 70s, when the hard hats versus the hippies, like the flag was really contested territory, like because the left should be able to control the flag because it's the discourse of freedom and emancipation and democracy. But for some reason, the right wing has been able to sort of appropriate the flag as this like symbol of patriotism. So these conscious color choices we're using to sort of re-invoke this history and to try to sort of bring back into contestation these symbols in our society that have been used for political freedom, for rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and like you said, there's so many different layers to you dealing in broken signifiers and symbols that become so big and unwieldy that they could really mean anything to anyone. And like even down to your color choice, you're allowing things to stay open, kind of like, you know, John's flags or targets, where those things are so recognizable they become meaningless in a form of abstraction. I'm wondering, like, wading into those things, like wading into that broken signifier, like kind of language, or that static that's like produced by like not understanding the color in the images. Like I'm trying to form my question here. I think there's something like really beautiful and poetic that you're able to, again, give us that ability to really understand and know these things.
I mean, I think I could maybe answer this or start to answer with like your referral to the caesura, to the stop. That is the gap between the word and the way it sounds that is used in poetry. These symbols are broken. Yeah, the signifier is unhinged, if you want to sort of use that kind of language. and the signs unhinged. We're putting them on the page as broken. We're not trying to fix them. We're not trying to say this is the way it's done. We're showing them as the broken image, the broken word, the broken thing itself. So you could look at it as an image and as a symbol as itself, and not as like this thing that's trying to construct other meanings, with the hope that that's where we can sort of put meaning back together. But we're not trying to fix it. We're just saying, here it is broken. Take a look at it.
That's what, now I'm picking up where I left off. That's where I was going with it, which the interesting thing that we've talked about before and we've had really wonderful conversations about is that those moments of broken signifiers or unhinged symbols are also the moments where culture war happens that you've talked about. That's where we fight for the flag, or we fight for the colors of the flag, or we fight for the symbols, because there's that empty space of who does this belong to and whose meaning does this have? And I guess my question would be, as we move on to the next slide, how do you feel these play a role within the culture wars? Do you think they're a reaction to, or is there a more objective distance from it, that, like you said, you want to leave things kind of unsettled rather than trying to like fight for who has the right to these things?
I mean, there's hope in that statement. How do we want them? There's also fear in that statement. How do we want it to be perceived, and how we hope to have it perceived? I mean, one of the most important, I mean, this is maybe again too art critical, so maybe someone should kick me, but I think one of the most important movements in thought in the last 30, 40, 50 years is to understand multiplicities and diversity and how multiple positions and multiple truths can exist simultaneously. That's not to say that there is no such thing as things that are wrong or bad or something like this, but setting it up so that multiple reads are possible and actually exist simultaneously, I think is the task that we have today in a multicultural world. I mean, maybe it's a little too romantic, but I actually kind of sincerely sort of like think that that's what we're trying to do. And many of these images are going to be read, if you have a certain position in the culture wars, you're going to maybe have an echo chamber and you're going to be affirmed, but hopefully not. Hopefully, like, there's enough sort of obfuscation in it that the meaning really is like in this like slow, like what's happening here, what's happening here, what's happening here, as we've been talking about.
That's brilliant. I love that. Zorawar, what do you think do you think the role of the artist should be to avoid the culture war in favor of like the hesitation or the delay? Do you agree?
Avoid the culture war. Avoid, I don't know.
I'm going to ask him about this one later.
Yeah.
Zorawar, do you want to avoid the culture war?
I don't really think it's that we're obligated to avoid the culture war.
We're in it.
We're in it.
This is it. This show is about it.
Yeah.
We're in it. The show is like, it's a volley. It might be it might be a squiggle. It's not a straight line shot, but it's certainly a shot.
I love that. And this one I really like, because again, going into montage and kind of this layering and density of images, there's like kind of riot shield or riot gear. There's also ambulances that seem kind of like a transition image between the protests and also COVID and the fear of isolation, which we're going to pick up in as we keep going through these. But can we go on to the next slide? This one I think is one we discussed briefly earlier, but I keep, out of all the images from the show, this is one that kind of stays with me perhaps the longest, or I keep circling back to. Would you like to explain the process? This began at the beginning of the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting, and what was it like finding the way to discuss or engage with such a traumatic moment?
We felt like we had to address it, that it was such a kind of confluence of protest, gun violence, white supremacy, and
Police presence,
militarized,
it's an image we kept looking at, and we had so many different drawings that we got to before we got to this one. So we kept bouncing it back, and we kept trying to get it right. We didn't want to make Rittenhouse look like the hero. We wanted Anthony Huber, the skateboarder who was shot, to really do justice a little bit and not just have it be about the gun. It was such a complicated image for us to sort of really put together. I mean, for me, most artists, I'm sure lots of artists know this, like the act of drawing something and thinking about something slows you down, and you can sort of process it and think about it. It's a way for us to deal with trauma. It's a way for us to keep looking at an image. Like, I remember like when print, we have to break this down into this we broke down into 12 different color separation layers. And I redrew Anthony Huber's body 12 times, dead body, right there. Someone that could be me. I've been to protests, like, I used to skateboard, but I can't anymore. And it's just like this, like, hours and hours, like looking at that is like, it's not cathartic. It's a force myself to sort of think about this again and just like, think about it. And at this moment when we were finally getting this image to a point that we thought that it could be carved and printed, the trial was happening right then. And we were refreshing our phones, like, what's the verdict? And the verdict took days. So at this moment, this is like as the verdict is out and before it comes back in and they let this guy go.
Yeah, it's such a horrible and senseless event, and I imagine this is, I think, the image I keep coming back to that I almost believe couldn't be done by a single artist, that this is really where your collaborative effort together must have had to come into play, where the two of you could talk about what's working best and how things are being interpreted and what you want to be cognizant of and aware of as you're trying to like deal with this thing, I would imagine. Which is, I guess, just a blanket, there should be more collaborative projects as the world keeps getting more complicated and difficult to engage with. I think that this kind of like lone artist, or the artist that thinks they have to solve every problem by themselves, wouldn't be able to come up with an image that has this this nuance, or at least this like integrity to it, if that can be like the word, or this way of like preserving without sensationalizing. It's a really impressive work for me. Can we move on to the next slide? And this one, I would love to hear you talk about this one, because this one has so many different tonalities. It's like really pastiche, or seems to be kind of like, again, Montage's conflict, like the Missouri couple standing on their outside their house with rifles, but then kind of surrounded by flowers. Could you talk about, or do you have an interest in revealing how you were thinking of the images? Because I also believe, you don't have to tell everything.
Well, we were looking at this event and photographs from this event, and also William Morris's wallpaper is the quotation there. And with that, associations of suburban life and class, and also James Bond posters and that kind of macho posturing, tiny guns pointing in all these different directions.
Part of our collaborative process is like, sitting in the studio working and doing drawings and carving and printing. But there's another part of our collaboration, which is like, let's go to the Met today, or let's go look at something. Let's go this one, we were at the Met and we were like looking at William Morris wallpaper, and after we were trying to deal with this like McCloskey image, and we had just had a technical way that we saw that we could break these woodcuts down, and they seemed to resonate with like suburbia and hiding and lattice fence and everything. We just had fun. This was a fun one for us, and we're like, this is the way we have 6 colors that we can get 50 colors on this thing. We know how the layers work now. We want to make the vines look poisonous. We want to make the birds look really ominous with red eyes. We want to puff up the face of this guy and make him look like this screaming baby that he was in a pink shirt, and the fear of the wife and the little gun and all of the sort of things. Yeah, I had fun on this one. I think so.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
definitely, I mean, part of being an artist, I know there's lots of artists here. Part of being an artist is like continue just the assertion of that, what we're doing. You can't just like put it in a box. It's fun. It's like you can sort of enjoy putting something together. This is an image that I think has, as we're being cheeky and we're being pokey. There's other ones that you'll recognize that we're doing that when they're here.
Yeah, I really like the discordance, or the seemingly discordant things, but I mean it's a wonderfully structured image too. Like it has a classical structure to it that's recognizable, which I really enjoy. Next slide. Another image, getting to this violence kind of right at the barrier, which seems to be a motif in at least a few of the works. These like the divides, or like kind of the don't cross or the barricades, and like getting a sense of like what were things like with the crowd pressing behind you, or pressing behind someone and forcing them into kind of the barrier between the other side. And this one, we'll get more into it in the next one. You can faintly see, is it correct to say his name?
Yes.
Which was actually came from the found wood, correct?
That was not literally written onto the found wood, because in the woodcut process, all text would be backwards.
Yeah.
The graffiti
correct.
that's on the it's more textural. The kind of you can kind of see in the bottom left corner of this image a kind of drippy texture that is from the graffiti that was on that wood.
And the graffiti that we're using was from, I mean, it is from the plywood. So we had photographed everything. I had photographed a number of things, and we're using the photographs of the wood back in the end as a way to sort of like a formal gesture to remove stuff and to open up space and to bury other images in there and to really make a slow read. One thing formally that we've learned in this project that we sort of knew is that text and faces, we're wired to see them. So you can really bury text in an image and you'll see it and it'll slow you down. And if it's not exactly legible, you'll pick it apart and all of a sudden it'll be legible. The same as with faces and the same as with hands. So it was like a formal device for us to bury these in there a little bit, to really, you see that they're there, you know it's there, you don't know what it says yet. And then you have to sort of like, oh, I see it. It says, say his name, it says Justice for George Floyd. It says, you know, I get to look at this, no justice, no peace, you know?
Yeah.
I'd imagine beyond the aesthetic concerns and the structuring of images, which is already difficult enough, that a lot of the decisions were, or a lot of the brilliance of these things is recognizing, like you said, like the signal versus the noise, like what translates quickly versus what translates slowly, which is really impressive to see your command of those things across these, because it could just all be swarm easily with someone that doesn't recognize the literacy, like the legibility of hands or faces or text the way you did. Next slide. Sorry, Zorawar.
I was just going to point out that in the previous slide that our source images do have a kind of variable potency that we were trying to very carefully use, knowing that some things such as George Floyd's face are so potent that if we were to depict them, which we did, we'd have to do it in the subtlest way possible.
Can we go back to that slide, Anya? Sorry.
There he is behind the gun, around the next to the N of name, you can see his face very faint.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. So let's move on to, I don't have anything to say other than, yeah, it reads as the shadow of the sleeve, and also the face. It's the delay is wonderful. Next slide. And this is another one that correct incorporated what was sprayed onto the board, but then, like you said, documented and flipped, so it wasn't literal to make sense of it.
Right.
I have another image of the detail so you can really see it. You can see "I can't breathe" with the dripping spray paint that you've then layered with such wonderful transparency. And also going back, I mean, I think I like that you don't make the distinction between digital and material. I agree that I think that that's an unnecessary, inequivalent thing, because it all goes together now. But I'm interested in the moments where you have to photograph something to then recreate it. But also, you talked about how there was carving involved after the CNC. I have to stop myself. I almost always say CDC because of how potent it is in our language. But the CNC router, what was the carving process like, or where did you choose to intervene with your hand in the carving?
Well, every one of the blocks has hand carving. The CNC is a really powerful tool for getting the block most of the way there, but it's still a mechanical mark that hand tools just, are superior. Just superior, and also just the experience of doing it on a piece of wood instead of looking at a screen was really important for us. We didn't want to spend this time just looking at a screen and sending it to a CNC machine. That being the project.
We've learned like how I don't know if it's the right way to say it, but we've learned how to trick the computer numeric controller a little bit by using custom brushes that we make in the shape of woodcut tools, so it carves like that. But we've changed the way that we work numerous times in this process, but we really realized that you have to get in there by hand and make some decisions at the end. So we would do things like, you have to build tool paths for a router to do it. So we would build 3 tool paths or 4 tool paths, and we would consciously throw one away. We would know what it is, but we would have to go back in and carve it. First time through. It's the only thing that makes this project possible is this CNC in a way, because I mean, you can see the size of these things, 57.5 by 45. Each one of these is 6 to 10 layers. This is 120 blocks that have gone into making the series. It's not possible for us to carve this by hand without like an army of assistants, which I don't think would even be ethical to do. And it's not even necessary. So I think I went too far.
No, that's it.
Did you come to be aware of each other's carving, like over the course of working so much with each other? Did you recognize each other's lines after a while, or how did that process work of sharing the workload?
We often carve this same block at the same time. I'll stand on one end, Rob will stand on the other end, and we discuss what we need to do. I think I recognize Rob's marks. I don't know if he'll say the same about me.
No, I know. I got to. After doing this long enough, I'm like, there's a Zorawar move. I've had lots of friends come to the show and say, oh, this is totally a Rob thing. This is a Rob thing. I had a really moment on Saturday when Derek Forger, who's Zorawar has worked with before, came to the show and was like, oh, this is a Zorawar move. I recognize this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's the Zorawar move. That's in there.
Love that. Did either of your moves rub off on the other one of you? Did any Zorawar moves come to you, Rob, or likewise?
Right. You want to take that one first? Because I'll just say yes to that.
I'd say yes. It's impossible for that not to happen.
I was like, Christmas, we were like, oh, the show's up. I was like, I just need to make a piece of mine. I had been working for a year on this project, and I was working on a reduction wood cut, and I had Zorawar like on my shoulder, like, do a test of that color before you do that. And I'm like, oh, I think we can just run through it. So his voice is there, and I think it'll be for always there when I'm working on stuff in a good way. In a good way.
I love the camaraderie that collaboration can create. Next slide, which I believe will be, we've got one more of the protests with sunflowers, keeping that heat as well. And really, I mean, it reminds me so vividly of that hot summer. Like even how hot it was at night when the sun went down, it was still burning on everything else. Next slide. Yes, so this is this is where you were pulling the plywood sheets from, correct?
Yes.
We had I mean, during the beginning of the summer, 2020, sorry, what year is it? In late June, when all of the plywood went up, I was out photographing Manhattan as this was happening, because it was empty except for like this very visible homeless population. So I was going out every morning, and I've been doing woodcuts for years, and I saw all this material all over the city, and I was like, something's got to happen with this project, with this wood. And it just seemed so poetically perfect to use this plywood that was shield. These institutions shielded themselves for many, you could point fingers if you want, or talk about that. MoMA, we wrote, I was like trying to find stores that would just give it to us, and it was very complicated because everything was closed, and I just started to write some letters. And MoMA very gratefully gave us all the plywood when they pulled it down. The Whitney did the same. So we were able to collect like 100, 120 sheets of plywood, which is a real gift to artists, because that makes us really give us the material to make a project like this, but also to explore and to try something new That's $12,000 worth of plywood. I wouldn't have bought that. I wouldn't have gone to the store to buy that,
We were really able to use it fearlessly because of that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, and the not to mention the trade exhaustion, or how much wood was priced at during that time. It just became impossible to build or do anything that didn't pay itself back immediately. Next slide. Just got a few more of seeing how those were wrapped around, which we all remember. And then the next slide. This is fun, getting to take it all away. Awesome. Next slide. And some of this language and graffiti and notation ended up in the work, like we said in earlier slides, but had to be kind of transitioned or mediated to read the same way.
Some of it's mediated, but for people who know how to print wood blocks, like different surfaces will have different textures, so the graffiti will be there and it'll come through in a different way. But there's a translation of it there. It might not be a literal translation all the time, but it's present throughout the entire project.
Right, like that black patch of spray paint when rolled with ink is going to hold the ink differently than the raw wood. All of those screw holes that are there from the wood being up there, the effects of the environment, of people gouging into those surfaces, that's all present. The wheat paste stuff that the ink sits up on differently than the stuff around it. The glue that's underneath it that makes more pressure here, less pressure here.
It's brilliant. I mean, I know it was also what was available, or I mean, it's an ingenious availability to reach out, obviously, but just to use such a rich kind of cultural strata, or like something that had a material history or a material life before you began to use it, and how that would affect the image is just so conceptually interesting and important to the work. Next slide. And I think we're to the one right after this one. Yeah. Police van on fire with some scalloping. Is that correct? The term?
Those marks on in the smoke.
Yeah. Or those.
That's actually done with an angle grinder.
Oh, much
which
more violent.
Was much more violent. And, just you can see it just torn into the surface of the wood.
You know, one of the things that we do as artists is like you try to make an analogy between the material process and the tools that you use with the subject matter. Angle grinder, wire brush, really violent. Like, what's going on here? Like, you know, and then once they, and it works together.
Yeah, totally. I mean, for a moment, looking at a small image on my laptop, even though I've seen this, I narrowed down the scale and imagined incorrectly, you know, like a small chisel. But you're right, at that scale, it's amazing its translation. That's like I mean, that's the small brush to big brush in painting. It's the chiseling to pulling out the angle grinder and getting that wonderful texture. That scale up is I guess dangerous and violent when it comes to what you're doing with carving.
Tried to pair it with the elegance of a historical carved line. That's what those orange flame lines are.
That's a 16th century like technology for visualizing fire, or fireworks that were applying, which is not really the way it looks from a photographic point of view, but that's the lines that, you know, an engraver would interpret an ink wash drawing that an artist would make historically.
That's amazing. Yeah.
There is a scalloping one. I know where you're looking for it. I don't know where it is in the slides, but scalloping is like, so it goes back to your CNC question. We would leave areas where the CNC would just leave it alone, don't let it carve anything. Scalloping is where you're doing a really shallow mark and you are left all this chatter. It's a visual set of information that you only get from like shallow tool carving. So they're built into these images in many different places too. This signal noise thing that's like hand tool. Is it carved deep? Is it not carved deep? Is it just like a noise?
Which is ultimately like I mean, you're both so poetic and critically engaged with, again, visuality, like you said, like the moments where it's decided how to visualize fire or visualize smoke or translate those things with line. And within that, there's so many poignant moments where you're making the choice to make things look like this type of woodblock printing, which itself has like a relationship to pamphlets or political handouts. And there are distinct choices that have to be scaled up to really have that legibility, which is wonderful. Next slide. I think that's, there's a detail shot I took of the angle grinder. Let's move to the next one. This one is a really frenetic one, but it has such a kind of twisting center, or that's like created from the arms going in different directions.
That's one of my favorite ones, I have to admit.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of has this like centralized force, like the falling figure on the bottom, the legs kind of splayed out. It's kind of got these like maybe religious structures, not to impose those on it, but like descending from the cross, or this kind of like symmetrical relationship of things hitting the edge. Very interesting. Next slide. And this one, I feel like has kind of the political sphere involved, you know, like there's the politics of being at the protests, and there's like the the politics of representation and power. You've got Giuliani and Stacey Abrams kind of as like the legislative voices kind of that float behind the barricades. What we've talked about it a little bit, but I'd love to hear maybe directly how you feel about the directness of politics engaging with art, or what you feel like art's role within politics. Do you view these images as political in and of themselves, or artists as political when they're making images? Or how are you thinking about your engagement with capital P politics as you're making this?
You want to start with that one?
Well, in the studio, we talk about the fact that it's a democratic process just between the two of us. I don't know if that's capital P politics, but
politics is negotiate. Is I mean, as for someone, and I don't want to take it too far in the political philosophy land. Habermas is maybe a little liberal, but like the definition of the political sphere is the place in which negotiation happens. That's not like what the situation we're at in today, where everyone just takes stances and this is my position and this is my position. That's a kind of political thing, but that's not conversation in politics. So the first thing here is us discussing it. In terms of art, it might be a stretch, but like one of the most powerful essays from the 20th century is Benjamin's Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproduction. And Benjamin was really trying to sort of make a space for, he was writing that in the 1930s when, for the people who don't know what's happening in 1930s Germany, you could think about fascism, sorry. But he was trying to make a space for artists to sort of, this is what's happened to the image. This is how art is read today. I want to make a space in which artists can actually respond to fascism. At the very end of that essay, he says something that I think is really interesting and still sticks with us. He says, this is the status of the image today because of this technology. Artists can either respond by aestheticizing politics or politicizing aesthetics. That's all that we have. Aestheticized politics is fascism. And we see that in our rallies and the flags and the employment of all these symbols. Politicized aesthetics is largely what the art world is engaged with today. And all the different things that we recognize as stances in the art world. We don't need to go too far in that direction. That's the side of that fence that I'm on a little bit, but we try to have kept the sort of propaganda out of it, try to keep it open, try to make like a politics that's still about negotiation.
Right, and the meaning of these images is being negotiated by these two conflicting.
This is an active, I mean, right now, Stacey Abrams, fortunately, in this showdown here between Giuliani's meltdown and Stacey Abrams, Stacey Abrams wins this moment, unfortunately, but it's still presenting this one moment in time that this was happening. And Giuliani, this is the one we had fun with too. Giuliani's literally got Georgia on his mind the day that Georgia was officially the recount was over and it's flipped, was the same day that Giuliani was doing his Pathways to Victory speech in front of the Four Seasons in Philadelphia. There's so much crazy stuff going on. Do everyone here remember these things? This happened.
Yeah.
This
Four
happened.
Seasons tool supply, landscaping and supply. Good moment of humor. Absolutely. Next slide. This one struck me as humorous as well. Or the massive macro fly kind of swimming over anything Pence could possibly say at that debate. And deservedly so.
You're right about this one being fun because we were like, let's make the fly bigger. Let's make the fly bigger. Let's make the fly bigger. How big can we make the fly?
Yeah. That's a beautiful relationship to the edge. It's well placed. Next slide. For me, last few images too, because it isn't just all about politics, but there are also images in the show that are about COVID and isolation. And I think I mean, it's not necessarily productive to speculate, but I always feel like these circles will stick out in my mind as something that, you know, telling grandkids and next generations is like kind of a moment, like seeing like these socially distanced ways of being in nature. Like it's a new way of living we all had to get to. And I love what you've done with it, turning it into this like grid. How are you thinking of the aesthetics for this one? If you want to reveal that, because I meant to say it earlier, but I totally believe artists have every right to keep things mysterious and not explain everything. So you can always tell me we don't want to elaborate, but how are you thinking of the design of this?
We wanted to have an image that addressed that feeling in the middle of the summer where it was deemed safe to be outside, socially distanced, of course, and what that felt like to be able to go to the park and yet have this looming fear of catching COVID, becoming hospitalized. In the grass, there's this face of a person on a ventilator. You see the eyes, the mask, and this tube. Over the course of the conversation and how to depict this kind of constant memento mori, we also came upon Holbein's ambassadors and the skull that's floating at the bottom. That's what that shape is there on the bottom there, a direct quotation of Holbein.
We really wanted to, like, every one of these images not just have one thing. We knew that the park circles was an important thing. We wanted to sort of bring it in, but we also wanted to have this, the fear of the face, the Holbein ambassador. These images in conflict again, these like multiple things going on. On this screen, when you look at something on a screen or on your cell phone or something, the image like reads a lot faster. I think this face comes out a lot quicker. When you are standing in front of this thing, it's much slower. You'll see the park circles first and how everything lines up. And it takes a minute or two for, oh, that's a face. And then I see in the chat, somebody recognized the ambassador skull really fast. I think it's possible because of the way that we're looking at it here on this screen and the way it like compresses it and makes it one quick read possible. When you go see the show, that whole read in which like you would see something on your screen or on your cell phone is going to get slowed down when you stand in front of a piece of work like this. That's your size. This is literally the size of you.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to note. It was amazing to me, some of the things that I did not catch when I was in the show in the space until I saw them as these like clarified images that could play with the contrast and turn things into, or the algorithms that try to make things decidedly recognizable. Because you're right, the delay is much more nuanced and complex in this space. And I love the Holbein reference. It reminds me, I luckily saved the quote, but in Bifo Berardi's new book, The Third Unconscious, he writes, "Death is back at the center of the landscape, that long denied mortality which makes humans feel alive," which I don't know if I fully agree with it, but he says that this centering of death, which we now have to confront on a daily basis, could be a moment for tenderness and collaboration and community that we've been able to avoid kind of through modernism and even postmodernism till right now. The floating memento mori schools, a prefigure of enjoying life. I don't know if I can, but I like the idea. Next slide. And I mean the chords of this one, the just the apparatus, like the wires and the electrical socket that like floats over a leg. I just thought this was like a really effective montage of like the sterility too of the color palette, the blues and the greens is kind of like sucking, like the air in this piece smells like that sterile antiseptic smell of the hospital room.
Yeah, your read is good.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I mean, we had a kind of central color palette, though, but every one of these is an opportunity to sort of do variations on this. Everything here is like desaturated, like literally, like, you know, when you take the complement and you mix it in and you just push all the color down to this more somber shade. I mean,
yeah.
The part about empathy that you were saying, I think, is also in this piece. I mean, there is, like, if you look at art history, representations of the body, like around the plague, when there was mass death in Europe and other places, but in particularly in Europe for the plague and the representations of it, those images that come around it, that's when humanism and that's when empathy for people actually emerges in a real political way. Modernism has somehow stolen that from us and made it all clinical. You go to hospitals in the 16th century, you see the murals with, like, you know, I don't want to go too far in this direction, with like Jesus being, you know, nailed to the cross, really visceral and being beaten up. You go to a hospital today, it's like this like clinical white wall, like everything has to be smooth. I'm going to read the essay from Bifo that I haven't read that one yet.
I'll send it your way. It's interesting.
Also see someone in the chat has caught the Montaigne reference.
Jason, yeah. Can't unsee it. Great, great recognition from Jason Rosenfeld. And next slide. And I wanted to finish everything on this one because to me, this felt like really the anchor, like the site of the entire exhibition. This is the one that feels most legibly like doom scrolling, the blue light of the screen being the only thing that like makes light and shadow. And then the New York Times piece. This piece is like the beginning and the end of the show for me. And I think, I mean, I'd love to hear you obviously talk about anything you want to with this piece, but and what it was like constructing it, making it. But I think I'd love to hear how you both feel. There's this weird conflict, or that I think we all felt, which is complete human isolation, or like being alone, physically embodied in our apartments, but maybe feeling unified by all reading the same articles and going on social media to see that someone you know has already shared it, or it's been shared a lot of times. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if that's if awareness is any type of collective feeling, or does it make us feel more isolated? I don't know if either of you have an answer, something to think about for it.
Learned from the internet that like communities can exist, quote unquote, virtually. So it is possible, and we've seen a lot of that happen. But this image is like largely more of a psychological space. Well, everything else in the series is external. It's something that happened on the street. It's something that happened in the hospital. Something that happened in St. Louis. You know, something that happened in New York City. This is really a mental space, and it was one that we really wanted to sort of capture this like alone. Our nickname for this one is doom scrolling, because it really is someone doom scrolling on their phone and just fear of staying up late, laying in bed, like we were all doing at that time. I mean, I was doing that on this day. I was looking at this stuff exactly like this, sort of being horrified, being kept into the house. Do you want to give up what else this image is?
Well, technically, this print is made out of blocks from other prints in the show. Those kind of swirling lines are the same, made from the same block that the exploding police van print is made from. That burst of light that's kind of behind the cell phone, that's from the Rittenhouse print. And the longer you look at it, the more you'll see fragments of images throughout the show. We wanted this to be a representation of what it feels like to see all of these images kind of colliding on top of one another. So even though the date of this piece is May 24th, it's a kind of foreshadowing of everything that's to come.
And it's a circle.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also a geeky thing, but we had in our mind something that printmakers call a cancellation block. So when you do a series, an edition of something, you'll print one where you strike it out, like you'll carve an X into it, and you'll make it not possible to ever print that again. This is a cancellation block of the rest of the show, where we carved various blocks from the different other pieces. We carved this face into it and the cell phone into it and made the space.
Which means it's impossible for us to ever print the other prints that are in the show again. It was a way for us to really just kind of seal
So
the
this
whole
is
thing.
the end of it. We're done with these.
Declare it finished.
Incredible. I mean, beautiful and poetic. I want to ask. I think I want to re-ask my question in a different way. Which those were wonderful answers, but I wasn't super clear. I don't take this project at all as nihilistic. I take it. I went to the show and felt like there was this collective, community-oriented memory that was important to like connect to. And Nietzsche said that nihilism is an endless becoming of time without future. And I don't think that this show is that. I don't think it's suggesting a lack of future. I feel like it has a potential that's suggesting. My last question would be: what do the two of you see within the doom scroll? Like, what is it that our community or artists or us as people? What's the alternative side of the nihilistic doom scroll? What is the site that you've chosen as doom scrolling? Like, how can it be a positive? Because I think that the two of you have really created something wonderful from it.
I think the positive would be to reopen these images, things that might kind of be sealed as fixed in the past for you. Things like any of the events that we've seen. To reconsider them would be, I think the positive version would be justice, real justice.
Yeah, real justice and really sort of like, I mean, not to go too far into the sort of philosophical side of it, but becoming is a process in which like there's like you're not being is like you're stable, becoming is like the process by which you're getting there. The nihilism is like was when we threw away in our mind in Western philosophy that there was an essence or that there was like something that was like preordained. It was the little oak tree that was the seed or something like that. We've thrown that. We now live in a moment that we know that we don't know what's happening in the future, and but we know that we're moving, and we know that that there is a process involved here. We got to throw away the nihilistic part and just embrace. If we say that the future is already determined, like the end of the world is going to come, or blah blah blah, or like environmental disaster is going to come, that's where we become nihilistic, and we just like give ourselves up to this like fate that's pre-set. I mean, I really hope that this set of images can sort of keep this debate, keep all the hopes, aspirations, and fears from 2020 and 2021 alive, keep them in the public discourse, and make it possible for like there was this moment of like real social change that was possible that is now starting to slip. We need to the next time someone gets murdered like this, the next time the racial injustice, the next time the political and social injustice, we need to not just be shocked that it's happening again and just react to it. We need to have a response that's built upon what we've already done. That's the way we're going to get out of this nihilistic becoming and get to the other side. Maybe too heady there, Andrew, but I think
I cannot think of a better place to end. So thank you both so much for the generosity of what you shared in going into this process and the depth of this show and the dimensionality of how you've spoken about all this. Thank you. And I want to now hand it over to, I think, a ton of questions that have been coming through, and I want to give everyone else the chance to talk to you. So thank you both so much for this.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew, for the really good questions. Oh my God, get me all wound up.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. These questions have been incredible. Thank you, Zorawar and Rob. And we have some audience questions. Our first question comes from Jason Rosenfeld. So Jason, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Thanks so much, Anya. Appreciate it. Thank you, Andrew, as ever. I'm glad to be able to tune in today, and got to get over to Petzl, obviously, because I haven't been there yet. You know, I love the whole conversation, and the visuals obviously were super stimulating, which they're meant to be. You want to keep looking at them. But I have a question about related to your discussion of use of symbols. You know, talking about the idea of this multiplicity of reference and multiplicity of readings that one can get with responding to symbols, and it's something that I think goes back to Victorian art, like everything, and the Pre-Raphaelites, who were the first to really start using symbolism in a way that wasn't something that represented a specific doctrine or perspective, but rather could be read in multiple ways. They're doing this in the late 1840s, and it directly leads to what goes on in symbolism in the late 19th century, and the idea of you know, separating the objective from the subjective, and vice versa. So do you see your practice as something that is related? Obviously, there's an art historical depth to your work, but related to these kind of ideas of symbolism, which are so different from modernism, but it's very connected to postmodernism, and also the kind of drawing from high and low culture, which you obviously do so fluidly, and is so important to teasing meaning out of your work.
We take color from the symbolists a little bit. I know.
For
I know we
sure.
take color from. I'm talking to Zorawar. Like, I'm asking him the question before I answer it. I know we take color from the symbolists, but symbols, the multiplicity is. I think about that. I mean, the symbolists were opening up an alternative, like not a romantic modernism, but another. It was a response to modernism that was happening at the time, that made for multiple possible reads. I think you're right there. So we were doing something analogous.
I want to look at these prints behind me. Yeah, I often think about like Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. That's like a 16th century text where the meaning of things is so, it's a book of what things mean. It's very strict and practically objective. I think we're really doing the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's like
where meaning is much more flexible.
Like an arcades project in a way, or yeah.
I mean, I think there's a kind of symbolist trend that's going on in art right now, in a lot of contemporary art, both visually and also thematically, and also a kind of return, obviously, figuration, which has never been so present in our memory, I would say, but also something which is emotionally enabled. And I feel like you guys are a part of that, which is a good thing.
Okay,
Great,
cool.
thanks.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you,
Our next
Jason.
question will be coming from TTO, and you can turn on your microphone. Hello?
Hi, excuse me. I kind of feel like a lot of my question has been answered already, but I just wondered, the tactility of the printed images is just so strong. I wondered, how are these printed? Is it by hand or by press? What inks or pigments do you guys use? What paper? And do you kind of get into the making and the printing process as much as you get into the visuals and the aesthetics? Do you sort of are they sort of concurrent with each other? Do you sort of live the images as you're making them, I guess, physically?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The wood is kind of an uncooperative collaborator. Well, cooperative and uncooperative. It has its own, like, just because of it being outside and being uneven, we have to negotiate with what it's willing to do with us. The paper is Stonehenge, pretty heavy. The press is
right behind us. There's an etching press right there.
Big Charles Brand.
The ink is on the wall back there. You can see it. It's like mostly, it's litho ink that we're using, Henko litho ink. And you know, it's like drawing. So between the visual and the process, of course, they're linked. But the way that you draw, the way that we're looking at drawing, is not. How do you say it? It's like we've had so many different times in this project where people have been like, "Oh, can we see the drawing? Can we look at the drawing?" Like there's like some thing on a bar napkin that we actually have this great black and white like ink wash drawing that we did. The drawing that you do in this medium is, if you're working inside the medium, is the way that you put mark on the page on the block, but it's also the way you apply ink and the way you apply pressure. Then the drawing always happens as you're working. It's part of the process. It's a thinking process that you see once you get it on the wall and you continue to draw into it. So like the process of building the image and the process of printing it is almost the same process as the aesthetic decisions in which we're using to put it together.
Right, and that includes also manipulating the block, manipulating the ink, manipulating the pressure on the press. All of these factors are being juggled at once.
Stonehenge on paper.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Lithoing Stonehenge on paper.
heavy Stonehenge.
320 GSM Stonehenge.
So I just find the images are very sculptural, and also the processes very sculptural. And I also wondered if ever, or if you had an idea to actually show the blocks as objects of their own right. I come from a line of printmakers, and I often find the blocks are as interesting or more interesting than the prints that come off them.
Well,
Needs to be conceptually justified.
yeah, we think that the blocks are artifacts of the process, and they are so important to the story, but they aren't exactly artworks. So we wouldn't want to display them as if they were. So it is a conversation we've had, and we haven't really concluded a way to show the blocks.
We did a project last summer, at the end of the summer, at 601 project space.
601 Art Space.
601 Art Space, in which like we did a piece in which like we took the graffiti blocks and boarded up the front of a gallery, and we carved into it some photos we had taken at the protests of people holding signs, but we used the graffiti that was on the plywood as like the protesters were holding up these signs that were graffitied. So we are totally interested in like the way in which the blocks can be used, and the way in which like the slippage between sculpture and printmaking is like, it's all there. But in terms of these blocks, we were just like, going through them on the way to this morning. We were like, oh gosh, we put them in storage. When do we throw them away? Like,
Yeah.
They take up so much real estate, and for someone in New York, the studio in New York, like there's so much stuff that I'm going to hold on to. So we don't know. But if you have an idea, you can send it to us.
Thank you, TTO, for your questions. Our next question will be coming from our very own Ty Cooper.
Hi, thank you both so much for this conversation, and thank you, Andrew, of course. Obviously I have the benefit of working at the Rail, so I was looking at these images as I was making the slideshow, and then listening to you both today, I was wondering what your interest level or interaction with AI art is, because I don't know if you've seen like the AI representations of text to photo work, but it's pretty wild. And I think like when we're in conversations around words like doom scrolling and things like that, these things start to enter the conversation. So I was wondering what your relationship to something like that is. Even I'm thinking of there are like these free softwares that the kids on TikTok are using to try to see if they can guess what is coming out of these things. And so I'm wondering what your relationship to AI is in this work.
You want me to try that one first, or do you want to try that one?
Well, there's a couple ways to approach it. I know Rob has been reading about AI recently. And there's a field called post-digital printmaking that I guess we see ourselves included in, but we find that the computer-made decisions are a little predictable and not as exciting as human decisions. I don't think we're ready to give that agency away. And to just the physical material is so crucial to this that to hand it all over entirely to a computer-based process feels like it's missing a lot. That's me personally.
Artificial intelligence is, if I understand it, the way it's progressing is that it's about feedback loops, and it's about how to get how can the machine have input back into it. The way the feedback loops work in our minds is like we see something and then we try to do this and it doesn't work, or it works, and we put that information and then we learn how to do it better. There's not like robust enough feedback loops yet in this sort of what we're trying to do post-digital printmaking. There is a feedback loop because like we know historically what makes a really interesting woodblock and what makes a really interesting print and what makes an interesting painting, and we're discussing it. And as we're, breaking images up and redrawing them and coding them and using the digital tools, we're providing that information back to Photoshop and back to Illustrator so that the CNC can do it, and then we see it. So we're part of the feedback loop that are bringing these images into this like very complicated place that I think like if you're a printmaker or artist, I think when you go see the show, you'll recognize that these are a step in the sort of trajectory of like what this medium can do, because we're actively engaged in kind of a wacky collaboration with our machines and our tools in a way that we are in our society right now. And that if we're not going to let, I mean, I don't want to be like Terminator on everybody, but if we're not going to let the machines take over, like we people need to be part of the feedback loop and give information to our AI. That's maybe a little too esoteric though. I'll say one other thing though, like in terms of what Zorawar mentioned, this term called post-digital printmaking, and it's been said often in media studies and media theory that the first thing that a new media looks like is like a mimicry of the last media. So when lithography was invented, it looked like engraving. When photography was invented, it looked like lithography. When we've reached a point right now with our inkjets and dye sublimation and CNC that it no longer has to look like the last technology we had, which was like good color photography maybe. It can be something different now. And we artists have a moment in this like very historically specific moment that we can intervene with what the next media is going to look like. And that's kind of a powerful motivator for both Zorawar and I to be sort of engaged in sort of something that comes up when you say AI and artificial intelligence and how art is related to it. Because we can choose. If you take a inkjet printer that's 20 years old and pull it off 10 years old, you'll see cyan, magenta, yellow, black. And then the next generation, you'll see light cyan, blah, blah, blah. Now when you open it up, 10, 20 years later, you'll start to see colors that are outside of that gamut, that are green, orange, greens, and yellows. That's because the technology of the screen and RGB is starting to sort of push back onto an older photolitho developed process that the inkjet printer was first developed by.
Right.
Now, we are doing the same in how we're sort of breaking these images up. We're adding another level and another set of learning and another set of just awareness to it and the construction of these.
But also, woodcut being such an old process, such a process for the mass communication of ideas, that's really crucial to this project too, that it's this incredibly old process.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I was on mute, and also my mask is on, so you can't see, but I was making weird noises and being excited the whole time. So thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ty, for such a generative question. Our final question will be coming from our own publisher, Phong H. Lee.
Thank you, Anya. Man, that was an amazing conversation.
Thanks, Phong.
Thank you.
And Andrew is terrific. I was caught from a few meetings earlier, but I managed to listen to almost all of it. And you know, I remember my own interview years ago with Kanwa, you know, the great filmmaker, our Kanwa, and we talk about the politics of power, violence, and justice in relation to his own multi-layer installation. But it's all have to do with narrative that generate from zone of conflict. Zone of conflict is something that I feel this layer printing process that you guys collaborated really emerged from. And why thinking about the materials, you know, which is the plywood that were available, and you managed to basically get them all. That really the agent urgency, material agent urgency, I would call it, you know, is the material urgency that remind me a beautiful quote of Gandhi that say adaptability is not imitation, it means power of resistance and assimilation. So there is subversiveness to the work here, you know, that's for sure. But you were talking about futurism earlier, Rob. You mentioned briefly about it, and we just have to kind of remind ourselves, you know, we have to remind ourselves that Benito Mussolini, Benito, first of all, is not an Italian name that was given to him by his mother, who was a school teacher, Catholic, and his father, who was a blacksmith. Both of them were serious member of the Italian Socialist Party, and so was Benito, the young Benito. And don't forget his two names. Mussolini's full name is Benito Andrea, I think it's Avocare Andrea, and then Mussolini. So even the two middle name was named after two prominent Italian socialists, Andrea Costa and Amilcare Cipriani. And it's so interesting that he also became famous as a writer and editor of Avanti magazine in Milan. Not until he advocated for Italy to enter the war that he got kicked out by the party. That's when he grew seriously bitter, then joined the army. That's where he met, don't forget, Filippo Manaretti, the founder of Futurist. Futurist Party or the Futurist art was founded in 1913. So it's really way back. And what is futurism? It's speed, technology, and violence. So Mussolini was able to subvert what he learned from Manaretti. And you're absolutely right, it is our job. The artists have to do the opposite now. So I don't know, achieving our country. I'm reading Richard Rorty, 1998 book. It's amazing book. If you haven't read it, I would recommend you to read it because he make a distinct differentiate between the cultural left and the reformist left. The latter being tied to John Dewey, pragmatism. And it's so exciting to learn all about this activism, the immediacy of trusting your own public sphere, the urgency of participatory democracy, and all of it. And that's why this collaboration is amazing. It's meaningful, and I love the fact that you can act on your feet so swiftly. It's just like no more, no less than, let's say, neo-realist cinema was made, you know? Pasolini, when he made all the great films that we admire so much, Acatoni, 1961, with all untrained children from that town that he made. Same thing with Bicycle Thief, The Seeker, maybe a year earlier. The father, whose name I forgot now, but the character of the film was named Antonio, remember? He brought his own son to be casted for the character, the son. And they like him so much, the Sika, that he asked him to be playing the father. Only with one condition. After the film is done, please be sure you get back to the factory and be a worker again. So I think all of this, deployment of urgency, it doesn't have to go through a certain bureaucratic institutional process. I'm happy that you were able to do what you did, just like what we did on our own social environment. We put it together overnight. So yeah, thank you so much for swiftness. What we call again, grateful to Peter Limber Wilson. Temporary autonomous zone, we are doing it. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see the show. I'm sorry I'm slacking behind, but I will go see it.
Let us know when you want to go see it. I'll meet you there. We'll talk to you. And then, if anyone else at this room, who's in this room Zoom, wants to sort of say they're going to go to the show, Zorawar and I are making ourselves available. Because we
go to the end of the day with maybe a couple bottles of champagne over drinks.
Great.
Right.
That's the best negotiation.
Can't wait, guys. Can't wait. Thank you, Andrew. Back to you.
Thanks everyone at the Brooklyn Rail and NSE. But there's a poetry meeting too. It's not over.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Come in.
I'm going to save your poet because that's part of the story.
That's right.
Thank you, Phong. Thank you, Zorawar and Rob and Andrew for this conversation. As you mentioned, we end every one of our events with a poetry reading, and today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate, Imogen Christian Smith, to the stage. Poet and performer Imogen Christian Smith's first book, STEMmy Things, is forthcoming from Nightboat Books this September. They are an Emerge Surface B Fellow at the Poetry Project, and they live and work on Lenape lands in New York City. So Imogen, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anya. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for having me again. This has been a wonderful conversation to listen to. I'm going to read a new sequence that I'm working on. Let's see. Yeah, it's kind of like a projected book number 2. So it's in the works. Something that won't show up, obviously, is that there's a sort of collage element to this poem where either direct quotes or ideas from other poets or thinkers are cited within the poem itself. But that's kind of a reader's experience and perhaps not a performative one in this arena. Anyway, it doesn't really have a title. I'm just going to start reading. But thank you, everyone. I'm obsessed with red bursts quickening underbelly, my platelets and poemless spleen, my pinkening fascia bagging up lungs, black hole holy and washed out bones, the self-contained knowing which is not absolute. Cracks of listening, milk of new mornings, with and to the body's molecular gastro-oxygen-rich perspectives. To love and be loved, present in multiples, affect and entrails open-sourced, body plus people, more people at once, how at once makes the present stretch outward toward 4 great corners as I feel myself becoming part of an organism so much larger than. The paradox being that any I gets subsumed or excoriated, redistributed amongst, but in a way that edges equilibrium, teases without achieving, begs a tender tending. State names bodies in relation to surveillance. This apparatus forges desire in the state. A monstrous reception greets what pegs me. Useless whimsy beyond a man's watch, these hours worth more to me than. If I ask you to fuck my gender, then I need the language to choke your imagination until meaning goes deeper, 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 deeper. Not just the matter of words themselves, though they're material too, and as much as they weld worlds, but into places you suppose are irreducible. Like damn vertigo, I'm asking you to let language evoke through you, become the verb and trust your smarts. There's bacteria mealing in you yet. It's true, everything that is has already had its moments, and nothing is new under the sun, 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 the sun. But likewise so that becoming or being is a matter of perspective, angle shim, a slight jostle and vanish, just a wee bit novel, adding feed to the new. I let my guard go unfettered down bus lanes, finger the budding grove, this warm flash of seepage in my chest, nipples hormonal and peeking through sewn lips. When the estradiol dropped, I immediately knew. Knew what? The immensity of my own dignity and how this binds me one to whole. On the other side of the poem, we'll say I fell hard, crushed on myself, flashed a buck-tooth helium grin to all the girls and true punks in the world. My body more me and mine, therefore possessing the wherewithal to sway sluttier, ecologically, Kropotkin-y, emotionally, fuckably sluttier than it had ever been before. I ate a bowl of borscht, 3 pierogies and a cookie before walking myself home. Fulton Street, Class and Pacific, something loose in my pockets. Desiring desires, I learned to ask for them. I ask the wind, douse me hot evenings. I ask Izzy if I can kiss them beneath the Myrtle Broadway stop. I ask the bodega worker to hold a neighbor's keys and later bring them pilfered marigolds. I ask the misconnection to miss me back, light like the life spooled across her aging face. Q train, East River, Manhattan, Hart's Bridge. Ask my body to feel a way through the sentence or line or image sensation toward undersurge and tension, the possibility of abrasion, assault excoriation, romance by the by and by. I ask Erica, can we hold hands on Houston a year after COVID paused what physicality we knew? I asked the moon last night, coin full with Aries, does rage have an end? And if so, pain too, because manifold forms of ache always sore me, coming at the tips of forever's lips. Words are the material shaping objects that will later be hurled at us. Us here is meant to evoke a many that may or may never cohere. Another question of desire as you and you like it. Everything thirsty below the sun, the sun, the sun, the sun, the sun, the sun, the sun. Evenings are for sex and soft drugs, a handful of paragraphs written or read, gravitational erotic flotsam between precarity and nasal swabs, trips to several pharmacies, markets, bookstore and booze, the rave in Queens last Thursday night, all slick with lube tongue sweat. So rare's a pleasure. Oft guilt in plague times, naked in bed, folding my sorrows, listening to Julius Eastman as cars zip Pacific and pitch, dream. Every suburban lawn, every golf course, a salad in waiting. Salads for all, everyone eats freely as much as possible. Fattens asses, stretch line ridges, booty bounty, stuck to lips. Imagine a planet you're born arbitrarily and still have to pay to live. Meet me in the penultimate bathroom stall where I'll be serving up salad for anybody hungry. Come on now, save jealousy for pop songs. Boys with guitars and self-referencing bands. Worms to the ear tunneling fast about the truck bed. Sunrise and wind. Drunk on drugs, body 22. Goddamn, goddamn, goddamn the dynamic possibilities of a grammatically incoherent sentence. What a long, long, long form slippage. When I tried my hand at heteronormalcy, no unhinged happiness could touch me. What loss we've known. How can you view sexuality so narrowly and take pleasure in anyone's any? Prickly, yes, but my question stands. How would I know you if I'd never got the memo? How would I love you if I didn't love your pleasures? Let me bring the marshmallows, bring chocolate and cherries, pool kindling for the fires stoking out back. It's a fantasy where I'm happiest, knowing my friends are writing and or fucking, y'all merrily fingering quite publicly, barely knowing one another, and still adjacent pages, mutual pleasure, mutual, sweet onions in the garden. Dip inside, an aperitif for the evening's direction. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Imogen, for that wonderful reading. Great way to close us out. Thank you again, Zorawar and Rob and Andrew. And we'd like to also thank Ricky, Jason, and Co from Petzl Gallery for helping to make today's event possible. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where this will be uploaded shortly. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Jamal Biederman and Zoe Hopkins on the event of White Roads on Black Soil at James Fuentes Gallery. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by No Land. And you can now turn on your microphones to say thank you and goodbye. Thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you for having
Thanks,
us.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zorawar. Thank you, Rob. And
Go
thank
see
you,
the
Andrew.
Thank you,
show.
everybody.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
And
everybody.
thank you, Imogen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Imogen. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Zorawar.
Beautiful.
Can't wait to see the show.
Thank you,
Yes.
Andrew.
Thank you for the beautiful reading.
Hey,
Also. Woo!
Thank you.
Imaging.
Thank you, you guys. Please
great
come
week.
to the show. It's up for a while at Petzl Gallery.
It's up until February 12th, and
That's
they're
right.
open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 6.
Excellent. And they
Go
will
on.
text you for the end of the day for drinks.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, super soon. Okay, G, thank
Okay.
you. Cool idea. All right, G. Cool idea.
Take care, man.
Bye, everyone.
Congratulations, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah.
Have a good
Bye.
week.
Thank you. Beautiful reading. Ciao.
No.
Ciao.